There are moments in the life of a republic when an institution does something so consequential, so quietly transformative, that the country does not fully register it until weeks later, when the implications have already begun to settle into the bones of daily life. That is what happened in the United States Senate last week. And I have to tell you, watching it unfold in real time, watching the floor speeches and the procedural votes and the press conferences that followed, watching the way the chamber moved with a kind of grim, deliberate purpose that we have not seen on an immigration vote in over a generation, none of it surprises me. Not one bit. Because the country has been asking for this for 15 years, and the political class has been refusing to deliver it for 15 years. And the gap between what the public wanted and what the Senate would provide finally closed last Thursday afternoon at 3:47 in the afternoon Eastern Time, when the gavel came down on a vote that is now reverberating in every chancellery from Mexico City to Brussels to Beijing. Let me walk you through what just happened, because the rest of the news cycle is going to try very hard to bury it, and I do not intend to let that happen on my watch. Let's go back. Because to understand the scale of what the Senate just did, you have to understand the moment that produced it. February 2026. The new Republican majority has been in session for 13 months. They have spent the first year doing the things majorities do in their first year, confirming the cabinet, passing the supplemental, working through the regular order of appropriations. But there has been one bill, one piece of legislation, that has hovered over every other priority since the first day of the session. Senator Lindsey Graham, working with the Senate Judiciary Committee and a small team of Homeland Security veterans on the appropriations side, has been quietly assembling a package that everyone in the building knew was coming and that nobody outside the building was paying close attention to. The package was scored last month at $71.4 billion, roughly $43 billion for immigration and customs enforcement, roughly $28 billion for customs and border protection, the remainder distributed across detention capacity, immigration court infrastructure, technology procurement, and a new category of state and local reimbursement grants that the bill calls operational partnership funding. That last category is the one that nobody is talking about yet, and I will get to it, because it is in many ways the most significant structural change in the entire bill. That was the moment you could see, if you were paying attention, exactly what the new majority intended to do with the mandate it had been handed. The mandate was not subtle. The 2024 election had produced the largest single-issue swing on immigration in the history of modern polling. Voters in counties that had gone for Biden in 2020 had moved on average 11 points toward the Republican column. Voters in counties that had been reliably Democratic for a decade had handed Republicans their largest share of the Hispanic vote since exit polling began. The political class in Washington had spent 18 months after that election trying to convince itself that the immigration signal was about something else, about inflation, about cultural anxiety, about anything other than the thing the voters had actually said it was about. The Senate Republicans, to their credit, took the voters at their word. And the bill they just passed is what taking the voters at their word looks like in legislative form. Let's talk about what is actually in it. Because the press coverage so far has focused on the top-line number, and the top-line number is the least interesting part of the package. The $43 billion for ICE is structured in a way that has no precedent in the agency's history. Roughly $12 billion of it is allocated to a hiring surge designed to take the agency from its current authorized strength of approximately 21,000 personnel to a new authorized strength of 34,000 personnel over the next 36 months. That is a 58% expansion of the agency in 3 years. The bill includes signing bonuses, accelerated training pipelines, and a provision that allows the agency to recruit directly from active and retired military personnel under a new lateral entry program that bypasses several of the traditional federal hiring bottlenecks. The Office of Personnel Management estimated last week that the program will be fully staffed by the end of fiscal year 2028. That is a faster federal hiring timeline than anything the government has executed since the post-September 11th expansion of the intelligence community, and the bill writers studied that expansion line by line to build the new architecture. The $28 billion for Customs and Border Protection is structured around three priorities. The first is the completion of the Southern Border Barrier System, which the bill funds to a length and specification that will, by the Department of Homeland Security's own estimates, cover 91% of the southwest land border with continuous physical barrier and another 6% with what the bill calls virtual barrier infrastructure, which is the technical term for the integrated surveillance, sensor, and rapid response architecture that the agency has been piloting in the Rio Grande Valley for the last 4 years. The second priority is the expansion of the agency's air and marine operations with a procurement schedule that adds 47 new aircraft and 62 new vessels to the fleet over the next 4 years. The third priority, and this is the one that border state governors have been quietly lobbying for since the new Congress was sworn in, is a tenfold expansion of the agency's family residential capacity, with new facilities planned for sites in Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and a single facility in Southern California that the bill specifies must be operational within 18 months. Now let's talk about the part that nobody is talking about yet, the operational partnership funding. This is the provision that I believe history will remember as the most consequential single element of the entire package. The bill creates a new authority under which ICE and CBP can enter into reimbursable agreements with state and local law enforcement agencies for what the bill describes as enhanced cooperation on immigration enforcement matters. The funding for this authority is set at $9.6 billion over 4 years, and the eligibility criteria are written in a way that has produced an immediate electric response from county sheriffs and state attorneys general across the country. Any state or local agency that enters into a 200A7G agreement with ICE, the long-standing partnership program that allows local officers to perform certain immigration enforcement functions, becomes immediately eligible for reimbursement of detention costs, transportation costs, personnel costs, and what the bill calls associated administrative overhead at a rate of 115% of documented expenses. That 15% premium, that is the lever. That is what changes the political calculus for every county commissioner and every sheriff in the country who has been on the fence about whether to participate in federal immigration enforcement. The federal government is no longer asking them to absorb the cost. The federal government is offering to pay them a premium to do the work. By Friday morning, the day after the vote, the National Sheriff's Association had already issued a statement indicating that its members were prepared to enter into new 200A7G agreements in unprecedented numbers. By Monday, the Attorneys General of 19 states had issued a joint letter indicating they would be encouraging local agencies in their states to take advantage of the new funding stream. By Wednesday, the chief executives of 3 of the 5 largest sanctuary cities in the country had quietly informed their delegations that they would be reviewing their existing non-cooperation policies in light of the new federal funding environment. That is not a policy debate. That is a tectonic shift in the federal-local relationship on immigration enforcement. And it is happening because one provision, buried in a bill that the press is still describing primarily in terms of its top-line number, fundamentally rewired the incentive structure that has governed sanctuary jurisdictions for the last 15 years. Let me say that again because I want it to land. The Senate did not just appropriate $71 billion. The Senate restructured the relationship between the federal government and every county sheriff in America in a way that makes participation in immigration enforcement financially advantageous rather than financially burdensome for the first time in a generation. That is the change. The dollar figure is the headline. The structural change underneath it is the story. And then there is the international dimension, which is where the shock the title of this piece refers to is actually radiating from. The Mexican government received a confidential briefing on the package the morning after the vote. The Mexican foreign minister flew to Washington on Saturday for an unscheduled meeting with the Secretary of State. The Guatemalan and Honduran ambassadors requested similar meetings the following Monday. By Tuesday, the European Union's delegation in Washington had issued a statement, carefully worded but unmistakable in its intent, expressing concern about the human rights implications of certain provisions in the bill. By Wednesday, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees had issued a statement of its own. By Thursday, the foreign ministries of Canada, the United Kingdom, Germany, and Australia had all weighed in. The Chinese Foreign Ministry, which almost never comments on internal United States legislative matters, issued a statement on Friday describing the bill as a reflection of what it called the deepening internal contradictions of the American political system. That statement, taken at face value, is meaningless. Taken as a signal, it tells you that Beijing has read the bill, understood the bill, and concluded that the bill represents a significant enough realignment of American policy to warrant a public response from the Foreign Ministry. That does not happen often. It is happening now. I want to be precise here, because precision matters. The bill is not, despite what some of the more breathless commentary on both sides is going to suggest, a mass deportation bill in the sense that some of its supporters wanted and some of its opponents feared. It does not authorize the kind of large-scale interior enforcement operation that would require National Guard activation or military involvement. It does not suspend due process protections for individuals already inside the country. It does not eliminate the asylum system, although it does substantially restructure the timelines and the eligibility criteria in ways that will, in practice, dramatically reduce the number of successful asylum claims processed annually. What the bill does is build, fund, staff, and incentivize the largest civilian immigration enforcement apparatus in American history, and it does so on a timeline that puts the full system in operation before the next presidential election. That is what the bill does. It is enormous. It is consequential. It is, in the considered view of every immigration policy analyst I respect on either side of the issue, the most significant piece of immigration legislation enacted by Congress since the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986. The 1986 bill granted amnesty to roughly 3 million people and promised enforcement that never materialized. The 2026 bill makes no promises about amnesty and delivers an enforcement architecture that will, by the end of the decade, be operating at a scale that the 1986 bill's authors could not have imagined. Now let's talk about the vote itself, because the vote tells you something important about where the political center of gravity on this issue has moved. The bill passed the Senate 61 to 38. 61. That is a filibuster-proof majority on an immigration enforcement bill in the United States Senate in the year 2026. 11 Democrats voted for the package. 11. The list includes the senior senators from Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Nevada, Arizona, and New Hampshire, along with 5 others who represent states that have either border counties or significant immigrant detention facilities, or both. Every one of those Democratic votes was a calculated decision made after months of internal polling, after consultation with state party leaders, after a careful read of the 2024 election results in their own states. None of those 11 senators is up for re-election in 2026, but 8 of them are up in 2028. And the math they ran told them that voting against this bill was the more dangerous course politically than voting for it. That math, the math that produced 11 Democratic votes for a $71 billion immigration enforcement package, is the math that should be terrifying every Democratic strategist in Washington this morning, because it tells you that the floor of acceptable Democratic positioning on this issue has moved further in the last 12 months than it had moved in the previous 12 years. Some of the defenders of the previous status quo have pushed back on the framing I am offering. They say the bill is cruel. They say it will tear families apart. They say it represents a betrayal of American values. Those are arguments worth engaging with on their merits. and I will engage with them. But here is what is not a fine argument. The argument that the American people did not know what they were voting for in 2024. The argument that the 11 Democratic senators who crossed over were betraying their party. The argument that the public, properly informed, would have wanted something different than what the Senate just produced. Every piece of polling we have on this issue, going back 3 full years and continuing through the present week, shows the same picture. The American public, including substantial majorities of Hispanic voters, including pluralities of voters in immigrant-heavy congressional districts, including majorities of voters who identify as Democrats, has been asking for exactly the kind of enforcement architecture that this bill creates. That is the data. That has been the data for years. The Senate did not impose this bill on a public that did not want it. The Senate finally delivered, after years of refusing to deliver, what the public has been requesting in poll after poll and in election after election. Whether you agree with the public's request is a separate question and a legitimate one. But the question of whether the request was made, and made clearly and made repeatedly, is not a question that the data leaves open. I want to address something directly because I know how these conversations get framed. The case for taking this legislation seriously is not the case some of its loudest celebrants want to make. It is not about gloating. It is not about scoring points against the previous administration. It is not about the cruelty, real or imagined, of any particular enforcement action that may follow from the bill's implementation. Some of the people who will take what I am saying about the significance of this legislation and run with it will use it to dehumanize the very real human beings whose lives will be affected by the system the bill creates. That is wrong. The case I am making is not that case. You can believe that the Senate has just enacted the most significant immigration enforcement bill in modern American history, and still believe that the individual human beings caught up in the system that bill creates are entitled to be treated with dignity, with due process, with the basic respect that any humane society owes to people within its jurisdiction, regardless of their legal status. Those two things are not in conflict. They have never been in conflict. The critique of the previous regime was that it had abandoned the enforcement architecture that a sovereign nation requires. The legitimate critique of the new regime will be whether it can build that architecture without abandoning the human standards that a decent nation requires. Those are different questions, and they have to be held separately. And the people who are about to collapse them into a single question in either direction are the people who will do the most damage to the country in the coming months. The reckoning is now arriving. You can hear it in the way the appropriations committees in both chambers are already revising their 5-year baselines to absorb the new spending. You can hear it in the way the state attorneys general who built their careers on opposing federal immigration enforcement are now quietly redrafting their litigation strategies because the legal terrain has shifted underneath them. You can hear it in the way the immigrant advocacy organizations, the ones that have been the most effective and the most serious operators in this space for the last 20 years, are convening emergency strategy sessions to determine which fights are still winnable in court and which fights have been definitively lost in Congress. You can hear it in the way the corporate general counsels of the largest employers in agriculture, in hospitality, in construction, in meatpacking, are scheduling urgent meetings with their compliance teams because the workplace enforcement provisions of the bill, which I have not yet had time to detail in this piece, but which I will return to in subsequent commentary, are about to transform the cost structure of American labor in entire sectors of the economy. The bill is not the end of the immigration debate in America. Nothing in politics is ever the end of anything. The bill is the beginning of a new chapter, one in which the enforcement question that has been theoretical for most of the last 40 years becomes operational. What happens in that operational phase, how the new architecture is built, how it is supervised, how it is restrained where it should be restrained and empowered where it should be empowered, will determine whether this moment is remembered as the restoration of a functioning immigration system or the construction of something darker. That determination has not yet been made. It will be made day by day, decision by decision, by the people who staff the new agency, by the courts that supervise it, by the local sheriffs who now have a financial incentive to participate in it, and by the political leaders in both parties who will have to decide whether to use this new architecture wisely or to abuse it. The Senate floor on Thursday afternoon was the first moment of that new chapter. The vote was the warning sign for some and the deliverance for others. The $71.4 billion was the dollar figure, but the structural change underneath it, the rewiring of the federal-local relationship, the hiring surge, the international response, the 11 Democratic votes, those were the real story. Each of those elements, in retrospect, will be the thing the historians focus on when they write about this week 30 years from now. The country has been asking, with increasing impatience, for the federal government to decide what it actually believes about the question of who gets to come here and on what terms. The Senate has now answered that question, or at least it has answered it for the moment, in a way that has produced reactions from Mexico City to Brussels to Beijing, and that has caught even the most attentive observers in Washington off guard with the speed and the scale of its consequences. History will not remember this week the way the commentariat in Washington is currently framing it. The commentariat is treating it as another partisan vote, another talking point, another data input for the next news cycle. That framing will not survive. The bill is too large, the structural changes are too deep, the international response is too unusual, and the political coalition that produced the 61-vote majority is too unprecedented for this to be filed under the ordinary rhythms of legislative coverage. The Senate just did something that the American political system has been unable to do for 40 years. It enacted a coherent, fully funded, structurally sound piece of immigration legislation with bipartisan support. Whether you celebrate that fact or mourn it, the fact itself is not in dispute. The system worked or worked enough to produce the bill that the public has been demanding. The bill is now law, or will be by the time the House finishes its work this week and the President's signature is applied. The country will live with the consequences for a generation, and every chancellery on earth that watched the vote understands that something fundamental has shifted in the way the United States intends to govern its borders, its labor markets, and its relationship with the rest of the hemisphere. That is the news. That is what the Senate just did. The world is right to be paying attention.